The Force had always been a current that flowed quietly beneath the chaos of the galaxy, binding star systems together in ways few truly understood, whispering through the minds of Jedi and echoing faintly even in those who never knew its presence. Yet on the farthest edge of the Outer Rim, beyond the mapped hyperspace lanes and past the forgotten graveyards of ancient civilizations, something stirred that did not belong to that current at all, something vast and ancient and utterly alien, and, for the first time in recorded history, the Force itself seemed to recoil as if confronted by a presence it could neither fully perceive nor comprehend. Across the galaxy, Jedi Masters paused mid-thought without knowing why, their meditations disrupted by a subtle but growing unease, as though a distant scream was building somewhere beyond the veil of existence, too far to hear clearly but impossible to ignore, while in the cold void between stars, where even hyperspace routes dared not reach, a darkness older than most civilizations began to move with slow, deliberate purpose. In the final years of the Clone Wars, when the Republic and Separatists were locked in a brutal stalemate that stretched across countless systems, the galaxy was already teetering on the edge of collapse, its resources drained, its people weary, and its leaders blind to the deeper manipulations guiding their conflict. And it was into this fragile, war-torn era that the first signs of something far worse began to emerge, not as a fleet of warships or a sudden invasion, but as silence. Entire systems along the Outer Rim trade routes began to fall quiet, their communications ceasing without distress signals, their hyperspace beacons going dark one by one, as if entire populations had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind only empty worlds drifting in lifeless orbit. At first, these disappearances were dismissed as pirate activity or separatist sabotage, the kind of localized disruption that had become all too common during the war, but the pattern was too precise, too methodical, and far too absolute for any known faction to claim responsibility. On the remote agricultural world of Coruscant Expanse, an unremarkable system that existed on the fringes of Republic awareness, the first true harvest began, though no one in the galaxy would yet understand what that word meant. The planet had no strategic value, no major military presence, and no political significance, which made it the perfect place for something unseen to test the boundaries of this new galaxy, and when the skies above that world darkened, the inhabitants had no warning of what was coming, no defense against it, and no understanding of the impossible shapes descending from orbit. They were not ships in the traditional sense, nor were they constructs of any known design philosophy within the Republic or the Separatists, as they moved with a kind of organic precision that blurred the line between machine and living entity, their massive, curved forms gliding through the vacuum with silent inevitability, their surfaces rippling faintly with energy that did not register on conventional sensors. From orbit, beams of searing, focused energy lanced down toward the surface, not indiscriminate bombardments like those used in planetary sieges, but precise, targeted strikes that systematically dismantled infrastructure, communication hubs, and population centers with terrifying efficiency, as though guided by an intelligence that had already mapped every aspect of the planet's civilization before the attack had even begun. Within hours, the world was reduced to a network of controlled zones, its surviving inhabitants herded by forces they could not see, their minds assaulted by whispers that did not come from any visible source, thoughts that were not their own slowly taking root within their consciousness, bending their will, eroding their sense of self, until resistance became not just futile but inconceivable. Far from that dying world, deep within the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, Master Mace Windu stood in silent contemplation, his eyes closed as he reached out through the Force, searching for clarity amid the growing disturbance that had begun to ripple across the galaxy. What he felt was not the chaotic turbulence of war or the familiar darkness of the Sith's influence, but something colder, more structured, a presence that did not burn with passion or emotion but instead operated with a kind of calculated inevitability that defied everything the Jedi understood about the nature of life and the Force itself. It was as though an intelligence existed beyond the boundaries of the Force, touching it only indirectly, like a shadow cast by something standing outside the light entirely. Across the temple, other Jedi felt it too, though none could fully articulate what they were sensing, and even Master Yoda, with all his centuries of wisdom, found himself troubled by a vision that came to him unbidden, a glimpse of stars going dark one by one, not through destruction, but through a kind of systematic erasure that left nothing behind, no echoes in the Force, no lingering presence of life, only absence. This was what disturbed him most, not the loss of life itself, but the way it vanished, as if it had been removed from existence rather than extinguished within it. Meanwhile, in the halls of the Galactic Senate, reports of the Outer Rim disappearances began to circulate among officials already overwhelmed by the demands of the war, and though some voices called for investigation, their concerns were quickly overshadowed by more immediate threats, battles that demanded attention, territories that needed defending, and political agendas that left little room for mysteries without clear strategic value. Yet beneath the surface of these discussions, something subtle was already beginning to take hold, a faint influence that nudged certain decisions in specific directions, encouraging inaction where action might have been taken, dismissing warnings that should have raised alarms, and slowly, imperceptibly, reshaping the priorities of those in power. On the separatist side, similar reports were received and similarly ignored, though not entirely for the same reasons, as certain leaders found themselves strangely disinterested in pursuing the matter, their focus shifting toward internal conflicts and resource allocation in ways that did not entirely align with their previous strategies, as if their thoughts were being guided by an unseen hand, one that did not command outright obedience but instead whispered suggestions that felt like their own ideas. Back in the void beyond the Outer Rim, the entities responsible for these events continued their advance, their movements coordinated across distances that defied conventional communication, their purpose singular and unyielding, as they began to map the galaxy not just in terms of space, but in terms of life, cataloging civilizations, analyzing technological development, and identifying the most efficient path toward what they had come to do. They did not rush, nor did they hesitate, for they had done this countless times before in other galaxies, other cycles, and they understood that the beginning of a harvest was always the most delicate phase, the moment when subtlety ensured success, and when the first seeds of control were planted within the minds of those who would unknowingly assist in their own destruction. As the first harvested world fell completely silent, its existence reduced to a data point within a vast, incomprehensible network of intelligence. The ripples of its loss finally reached far enough to be noticed by those who could not ignore it, and a small Jedi reconnaissance team was quietly dispatched to investigate the anomaly, their mission simple in design but unknowingly placing them on a path that would lead to the first direct encounter between the Star Wars galaxy and a force unlike anything it had ever faced before. And as their ship prepared to enter hyperspace, streaking toward a system that no longer answered calls, the galaxy remained blissfully unaware that the war it had been fighting for years was about to become irrelevant, overshadowed by a threat that did not seek victory or conquest in any traditional sense, but something far more absolute, something that would redefine the very meaning of survival. If you want to see more characters and forces from beyond the stars collide with the Star Wars galaxy in stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like and share this video with fellow fans. Drop a comment stating which crossover you want to see next, so you don't miss the next chapter in this unfolding saga, because what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about this galaxy. And as the stars stretched into lines of light and the Jedi vessel vanished into hyperspace, heading straight toward the unknown, the first whispers of something ancient and inevitable began to spread just a little further, reaching minds that were not yet aware they had already been touched, setting in motion a chain of events that would soon draw the entire galaxy into a conflict it was never meant to face. The Jedi reconnaissance vessel emerged from hyperspace into a silence so complete that it seemed to press against the hull like a physical force, suffocating in its stillness, as though the system itself had forgotten how to exist. There were no patrol beacons, no orbital traffic, no distant hum of civilian comm signals drifting across the void, only a dead star casting dim light over a lifeless world that should have been thriving. The planet below, once a modest but active agricultural colony, now hung in orbit like a forgotten relic, its surface scarred by geometric patterns of destruction that were far too precise to be the result of orbital warfare as the Jedi understood it. Master Depa Billaba stood at the front of the command deck, her posture rigid, her presence steady, yet beneath that calm exterior, the Force churned violently around her, not with chaos, but with absence, a hollowing sensation that seemed to swallow every attempt she made to reach out and sense life below. Beside her, her Padawan Caleb Dume felt it too, though in a far less controlled manner, his unease manifesting in quick glances toward the viewport and an instinctive tightening of his grip on the railing as if the ship itself might drift into something unseen. He had been trained to trust the Force, to rely on it as a guide, but here, it offered no clarity, only a void where something should have been, and that absence was more terrifying than any presence he could imagine. The other Jedi aboard the vessel, a small team dispatched for what had been expected to be a routine investigation, exchanged quiet looks, each one sensing the same unnatural quiet, each one understanding without words that whatever had happened here was beyond anything they had encountered during the war. As the ship descended toward the planet's surface, the damage became clearer, entire regions carved into symmetrical zones where cities once stood, their remains reduced to carefully dismantled grids rather than chaotic ruins, as though something had taken the time to methodically erase them piece by piece. There were no signs of conventional bombardment, no craters or scattered debris fields, only smooth, almost surgical devastation that suggested an intelligence far more precise than any military force currently operating in the galaxy. Even more unsettling were the faint energy readings that lingered across the surface, signals that did not match Republic or Separatist technology, fluctuating in patterns that seemed almost alive, pulsing faintly as though echoing a presence that was no longer physically there. When the landing ramp finally lowered and the Jedi stepped onto the surface, the air itself felt wrong, not toxic or unbreathable, but empty in a way that defied explanation, as if the very essence of life had been stripped from it. The ground beneath their boots was warm, faintly vibrating with residual energy that had not yet dissipated, and in the distance, the skeletal remains of structures stood in perfect alignment, their edges too clean, their forms too deliberate, like the aftermath of a process rather than a battle. Depa Billaba extended her senses once more, reaching out through the Force with careful precision, but what she encountered was not death in the traditional sense, no lingering echoes of suffering or loss, but something far more disturbing, a complete and total absence, as though the lives that had once existed here had been removed entirely, leaving no imprint behind. Caleb took a step forward, his voice low as he tried to make sense of what he was feeling, though the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, and before any answer could be given, a faint sound carried across the stillness, not through the air, but directly into their minds, a distant, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate at the edge of perception. It was not language, not in any form they recognized, but it carried a weight of meaning that pressed against their thoughts, something ancient and vast acknowledging their presence in a way that bypassed all conventional senses. The Jedi immediately shifted into defensive stances, their lightsabers igniting in unison, the familiar hum of their blades cutting through the oppressive silence as they scanned the horizon for any sign of movement. What appeared next did not emerge from the sky or rise from the ground, but seemed to simply exist where there had been nothing moments before, a towering construct of dark, curved metal that defied scale and proportion, its surface shifting subtly as though composed of layers that were not entirely fixed in place. It did not resemble a droid or a ship in any conventional sense, but something in between, something that blurred the line between machine and organism, its presence radiating a pressure that pushed against the minds of those who looked upon it. The Force reacted to it, but not in the way the Jedi expected, not as it would to a living being or even a dark side presence, but as though it were encountering something fundamentally incompatible, an intrusion that existed outside its natural order. Depa Billaba stepped forward, her voice steady as she attempted to establish contact, to understand what they were facing, but the response did not come in words or gestures, but as a sudden, overwhelming surge of thought that crashed into their minds all at once. It was not communication in any form they could interpret, but an assertion, a declaration of purpose that carried with it an ancient certainty, a sense of inevitability that dwarfed their individual identities. Images flickered through their consciousness in rapid succession, countless worlds, countless civilizations, rising and falling in a cycle that repeated endlessly, each one reaching a peak of advancement before being systematically erased, their essence preserved in a form that defied comprehension. Caleb staggered under the weight of it, his connection to the Force offering some resistance, but not enough to fully shield him from the intrusion, as fragments of alien logic pressed against his thoughts, attempting to align his understanding with something far older and far more absolute than anything he had been taught. The other Jedi fared little better, their training allowing them to maintain some level of control, but the strain was evident in their expressions, the effort required to resist something that did not attack in the traditional sense, but instead sought to overwrite. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the pressure receded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before, and in that silence, the construct moved. It did not lunge or charge, but advanced with a slow, deliberate motion, its massive form gliding forward without visible propulsion, as though the laws of physics themselves bent to accommodate its existence. The Jedi reacted instantly, their lightsabers striking against its surface in coordinated precision, but the results were not what they expected. The blades made contact, but instead of cutting through metal as they would against any known material, they met resistance that was both solid and fluid, the energy dispersing across the surface in rippling patterns that absorbed and redirected the impact. Blaster fire from the ship's support team followed, streaks of energy converging on the construct, but they too proved ineffective, dissipating harmlessly against a barrier that seemed to exist just beyond the visible surface. The construct responded, not with weapons in the conventional sense, but with a focused pulse of energy that emanated outward, striking the Jedi. With a force that bypassed physical defenses, impacting directly against their nervous systems, disrupting their movements and sending them crashing to the ground. It was not lethal, not immediately, but it demonstrated a level of control and precision that made its intentions unmistakably clear. Depa Billaba pushed herself back to her feet, her connection to the Force anchoring her against the lingering effects of the attack, and in that moment, she understood something that would change everything. This was not an enemy that could be reasoned with, not a faction with goals that could be negotiated or understood within the framework of galactic politics. This was something else entirely, something that operated on a scale and with a purpose that rendered the current war meaningless by comparison. The Clone Wars, with all their destruction and loss, were insignificant next to what this entity represented. The construct paused, as if observing their response, analyzing their capabilities, and then, without any further indication of hostility or retreat, it turned and began to move away, its massive form receding toward the horizon with the same slow inevitability with which it had arrived. It did not pursue, did not attempt to finish the confrontation, and that in itself was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all, as it suggested that the Jedi were not considered a threat worth eliminating, at least not yet. As the team regrouped, the weight of what they had encountered settled heavily upon them, the realization that this was only a fragment of something much larger, something that had already begun its work across the galaxy. The system they had investigated was not the result of a battle, but a process, one that had been executed with chilling efficiency and now continued elsewhere, beyond their reach, beyond their understanding. And as their ship lifted off once more, carrying them back toward the heart of the Republic with knowledge that would be difficult to convey and even harder to believe, the stars above remained unchanged, their distant light offering no indication that anything had shifted, that a new force had entered the galaxy, one that did not seek victory, did not seek power, but something far more absolute, something that had already begun. The first cracks did not appear on battlefields or in the distant outer rim where entire systems had already been reduced to silence, but at the very center of the Republic itself, hidden beneath layers of procedure, debate, and the illusion of control that defined the Galactic Senate. Coruscant remained as vibrant as ever, its endless cityscape alive with traffic and noise, its people moving through their routines unaware that the foundations of their civilization were already beginning to shift in ways no military report could yet explain. The war still dominated every discussion, every allocation of resources, every political maneuver, and yet within that chaos, something quieter had begun to take root, something that did not announce itself through destruction, but through influence. At first, it was nothing more than subtle deviations, small inconsistencies in judgment that could easily be attributed to stress, exhaustion, or the overwhelming pressures of leading a galaxy at war. Senators who had once been decisive found themselves hesitating at critical moments, delaying votes that would have reinforced defenses along vulnerable trade routes, while others pushed for reallocations that, on the surface, seemed logical, but in practice left key systems exposed. These were not drastic changes, not the kind that would immediately draw suspicion, but they formed a pattern, one that was almost impossible to detect unless viewed from a perspective beyond the political noise of the Senate floor. Within the Republic's military command structure, similar anomalies began to emerge as fleet movements were adjusted with increasing frequency, often based on intelligence that seemed credible but led to empty space, phantom threats that drew forces away from regions where real danger was quietly building. Admirals who had spent their careers navigating the complexities of war found themselves second-guessing their own instincts, relying more heavily on data that felt correct but lacked the underlying consistency they were accustomed to. The clone army, bound by discipline and programming, executed these orders without hesitation, their efficiency masking the subtle misdirection guiding their actions. None of this went entirely unnoticed, but those who questioned it found themselves isolated, their concerns dismissed as paranoia or the natural friction of a galaxy under strain. The war had already normalized a certain level of unpredictability, and in that environment, it became easier for something external to weave itself into the fabric of decision-making without drawing attention. It did not need to control every mind, only enough to influence the flow of events, to create openings where none should exist, to ensure that when the next phase began, the galaxy would already be positioned in a way that favored its outcome. Deep within the Senate, in chambers reserved for high-level strategy, discussions continued regarding the unexplained disappearances in the Outer Rim, though they remained secondary to the immediate demands of the Clone Wars. Reports from the Jedi reconnaissance team had been filed, their findings carefully documented, yet the language used to describe what they had encountered struggled to convey the true nature of the threat. Terms like unknown construct, advanced technology, and unclassified weaponry appeared throughout the analysis, but none of them captured the underlying reality, and without that clarity, the response remained measured, cautious, and ultimately insufficient. Chancellor Palpatine listened to these reports with his usual composure, his expression one of concern tempered by calculated restraint, yet beneath that carefully maintained exterior, his thoughts moved along far more complex lines. He had felt the disturbance in the Force as clearly as any Jedi, perhaps even more so, and what he sensed did not align with any known aspect of the dark side. This was not the presence of a rival Sith, nor the manifestation of some ancient Force entity, but something fundamentally different, something that existed beyond the dichotomy of light and dark. It intrigued him, not merely as a threat, but as a variable, a force that could potentially be understood, manipulated, or even harnessed if approached correctly. That curiosity, however, was tempered by caution, as the fragments of information he had gathered suggested a level of power and purpose that could not be underestimated. The reports of entire systems being erased without conventional warfare, the Jedi's inability to meaningfully damage the construct they had encountered, and most importantly, the descriptions of the mental intrusion experienced during that encounter, all pointed to a phenomenon that operated on principles outside the known frameworks of the Force. This was not simply another faction entering the war, but something that could reshape the very structure of the galaxy if left unchecked. Elsewhere on Coruscant, among the countless individuals who made up the machinery of the Republic, the influence continued to spread, though few would have recognized it for what it was. A communications officer rerouted a signal without fully understanding why, convinced that the adjustment would improve efficiency, even as it delayed critical information reaching its intended destination. A logistics coordinator approved a shipment to a sector that did not require it, leaving another system undersupplied at a crucial moment. These actions, insignificant on their own, began to accumulate, forming a web of subtle distortions that gradually shifted the balance of the war. For those directly affected, the experience was difficult to articulate, as the changes in thought did not feel imposed, but rather as natural conclusions drawn from available information. There was no clear moment of realization, no sense of being controlled, only a quiet certainty that their decisions were correct, even when evidence suggested otherwise. This was the true nature of the influence at work, not domination through force, but alignment through suggestion, a gradual reshaping of perception that required no overt resistance to overcome. The Jedi, for their part, began to notice the inconsistencies, not through data or reports, but through the Force itself, which carried a growing sense of unease that could no longer be ignored. It was not localized to a single system or event, but spread across the galaxy in a pattern that defied conventional explanation, touching minds and actions in ways that felt both distant and deeply connected. Some Jedi described it as a whisper at the edge of thought, others as a pressure that subtly altered the flow of decision-making, but all agreed that it was increasing, becoming more pronounced with each passing cycle. Master Yoda, in particular, found the development troubling as it echoed aspects of the disturbance he had sensed earlier, though now it carried a more defined presence, one that seemed to interact with the galaxy in a deliberate manner. He spoke cautiously of imbalance, not in the traditional sense of light and dark, but of something external exerting influence on the natural order, something that did not belong within the Force yet was beginning to affect those who relied on it. His warnings, while taken seriously, were difficult to act upon, as the source of the disturbance remained elusive and the demands of the war continued to take precedence. Beyond the core worlds, in regions where the Republic's reach was less direct, the effects were even more pronounced, as systems without strong central governance became increasingly vulnerable to the growing influence. Local leaders made decisions that isolated their own populations, cutting off communication and trade in ways that left them exposed, while others redirected their defenses toward threats that did not exist, leaving their worlds open to whatever might come next. These were not coordinated actions, not the result of a unified strategy, but the cumulative effect of countless small shifts in perception, each one guided by a presence that did not need to reveal itself to be effective. And in the depths of space, far from the political and military centers of the galaxy, the architects of this influence continued their work with unwavering precision, their awareness extending across vast distances as they monitored the progress of their initial incursions. They did not view these developments as manipulation or corruption, but as preparation, the necessary alignment of variables that would ensure the success of what was to come. The galaxy was being studied, understood, and gradually adjusted to fit a pattern that had been repeated countless times before, though never with the unique variable it now presented. The Force, in all its complexity, remained an unknown factor, something that resisted full integration into their calculations, yet even this did not disrupt their progress, only altered the approach. Where direct influence met resistance, they adapted, finding alternative pathways, leveraging those more susceptible, and allowing the structure of organic society to amplify their reach. It was not necessary to control every individual, only to influence enough to shape the outcome, to ensure that when the moment arrived, the galaxy would be unable to mount a unified response. As Coruscant continued its endless cycle of activity, its citizens unaware of the subtle shifts taking place around them, the stage was being set for a conflict that would not be decided by fleets or armies alone, but by the variability of the galaxy to trust its own thoughts. The war between the Republic and the Separatists still raged, its battles consuming resources and attention, but beneath that visible conflict, another war had already begun, one that operated in silence, one that turned decisions into weapons and doubt into vulnerability. And as the influence spread further, reaching deeper into the systems that held the galaxy together, the first true realization began to form among those capable of perceiving it, a recognition that whatever they were facing was not simply attacking from the outside, but was already within, shaping the course of events in ways that would only become clear when it was far too late to stop. The report from the reconnaissance team did not spread quickly through the Jedi Order, not because it lacked urgency, but because it defied the language and frameworks the Order had relied upon for generations, and when knowledge cannot be easily categorized, it is often delayed, questioned, and re-examined before action is taken, even in times of war. Within the quiet, towering chambers of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, the Council convened in a rare closed session, the atmosphere heavy not with fear, but with uncertainty, which for the Jedi was far more dangerous. Masters who had faced Sith Lords, commanded armies, and navigated the shifting tides of the Clone Wars now found themselves confronted with something that could not be understood through experience alone, something that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of the Force itself. Master Depa Billaba stood at the center of the chamber, recounting the events on the harvested world with precision and restraint, her words carefully chosen to convey not only what had been seen, but what had been felt, though even she struggled to articulate the absence that had defined the experience. She described the planet as not merely destroyed, but emptied, its presence within the Force erased in a way that left no echo behind, no lingering impression of the lives that had once existed there. The construct they had encountered, the entity that had neither attacked with intent to kill nor retreated with fear, was detailed as something that did not behave according to any known pattern of conflict, something that observed, tested, and then moved on, as though the encounter itself had been nothing more than a data point in a much larger process. As she spoke, the council listened in silence, each member reaching out through the Force, not to confirm her account, but to search for any resonance, any connection that might align what she described with something they could understand. What they found instead was a growing void, not localized to the outer rim, but spreading in faint, almost imperceptible threads across the galaxy, touching systems that had not yet reported any disturbances, hinting at a presence that was already far more widespread than the initial reports suggested. It was not an invasion in the traditional sense, not fleets arriving at the edges of known space, but something more insidious, something that operated beneath the threshold of immediate perception. Mace Windu was the first to give voice to what many were beginning to consider, though the words themselves carried a weight that made them difficult to accept. He spoke of the possibility that this was not the work of the Sith, not a hidden faction or a forgotten sect operating in secrecy, but something entirely separate from the long-standing conflict between light and dark. This suggestion alone shifted the tone of the discussion, as it implied that the Order was facing a threat that could not be addressed through the strategies and philosophies that had defined their role for centuries. If this was not the Sith, then it was something new, something that required a different understanding and perhaps a different response. Yoda, seated in stillness, his eyes half closed as he listened, allowed the currents of the Force to guide his thoughts, though what he encountered offered little clarity. He spoke slowly, his words reflecting not certainty, but caution, as he described the disturbance as something outside the natural balance, not aligned with darkness, but not part of the light either, something that existed beyond the cycle the Jedi had dedicated themselves to maintaining. This distinction, subtle as it was, carried profound implications, suggesting that the Force itself might not be equipped to fully comprehend or counter what was emerging. The discussion turned toward action, as it inevitably must, and yet even here, the uncertainty persisted. Sending larger forces to investigate risked escalating a situation they did not understand, while inaction would allow whatever was occurring to continue unchecked. The Clone Wars already demanded the majority of the Republic's military resources, and diverting fleets to pursue a threat that could not yet be clearly defined posed both strategic and political challenges. The Jedi, though powerful, were not an army in the traditional sense, and their role as generals had already stretched the Order in ways that many believed were unsustainable. Despite these concerns, it was agreed that further investigation was necessary, not through large-scale deployment, but through carefully selected missions designed to gather more information without drawing undue attention. Additional reconnaissance teams would be dispatched, their objectives focused on confirming the pattern of disappearances, identifying any common factors, and, if possible, re-establishing contact with systems that had gone silent. It was a measured response, one that reflected both the gravity of the situation and the limitations imposed by the ongoing war. Yet beneath this decision lay a deeper realization, one that was not fully spoken, but understood by those present. The Jedi were reacting, not leading, responding to events that were already in motion rather than shaping their course. This was not unusual in times of war, but it was deeply unsettling in this context, as it suggested that whatever they were facing had already taken the initiative, had already begun its process long before the Order became aware of it. Beyond the council chamber, the effects of the growing disturbance continued to manifest in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Jedi stationed across the galaxy reported similar sensations, a thinning of the Force in certain regions, moments where their connection seemed to falter or distort, not entirely severed, but altered in subtle ways that made it less reliable. These reports, once isolated, began to form a pattern, one that aligned disturbingly well with the systems that had gone silent or exhibited unusual behavior. In one such system, a Jedi Knight overseeing a Republic outpost found his ability to sense the presence of nearby life fluctuating without warning, as though something interfered with the natural flow of the Force. Patrols sent to investigate nearby settlements returned with conflicting accounts, some reporting normal conditions, while others described entire communities behaving erratically, their actions lacking the cohesion and purpose expected of organized populations. These inconsistencies, while not immediately catastrophic, hinted at a deeper disruption, one that affected not only perception, but behavior. Back on Coruscant, the Council's decision began to take effect. With new missions launched under the guise of routine operations, their true purpose known only to those directly involved. The Jedi Order, though cautious, was beginning to shift its focus, recognizing that the disturbances in the Outer Rim were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader phenomenon that required attention beyond the immediate demands of the war. At the same time, Chancellor Palpatine continued to observe these developments with growing interest, his position granting him access to both military intelligence and Jedi reports, allowing him to piece together a more comprehensive understanding of the situation than most. Where others saw uncertainty, he saw opportunity, though not without risk. The presence of a force that operated outside the influence of the Force itself presented a unique challenge, one that could not be easily manipulated through the methods he had perfected over years of careful planning. Yet it was precisely this uniqueness that made it valuable, as it introduced a variable that could disrupt the balance of power in ways he might be able to exploit. If this new force could be understood, if its methods could be adapted or redirected, it might serve as a tool, a means of accelerating the collapse of the Republic and the rise of the Empire he envisioned. But such considerations required caution, for unlike the Jedi or the Separatists, this was not an opponent that could be controlled through deception or fear, at least not in any way he currently understood. Far beyond the reach of these deliberations, the entities responsible for the growing disturbance continued their advance, their awareness expanding as more systems were catalogued, more variables accounted for, and more pathways established. The initial phase, the subtle alignment of conditions, was progressing as expected, though the presence of the Force introduced complexities that required ongoing analysis. Certain individuals exhibited resistance to the influence that had proven effective elsewhere, their connection to this pervasive energy field providing a form of protection that was not easily circumvented. This resistance did not halt progress, but it did alter the approach, necessitating a more targeted strategy in regions where such individuals were present. The objective remained unchanged, the process inevitable, but the methods adapted as they always had, refined through countless cycles across countless galaxies. The Star Wars galaxy, with its unique characteristics, was not an exception to the pattern, but a variation within it, one that would be understood, integrated, and ultimately harvested like all those that came before. As the Jedi prepared to extend their reach, to confront a threat that still lay beyond full comprehension, the realization began to take hold that they were not facing an enemy that could be defeated through strength alone, but something that required a fundamental shift in understanding. The Force, which had guided them for so long, remained their greatest asset, yet it also revealed the limits of their knowledge, as it struggled to fully encompass what was now emerging. And as new missions departed from Coruscant, their destinations marked by silence and uncertainty, the galaxy moved one step closer to a confrontation that would challenge not only its armies and leaders, but the very principles upon which it was built, as the line between known and unknown continued to blur, and the first true test of this new threat began to take shape. The Clone Wars had already transformed the galaxy into a battlefield defined by scale, efficiency, and the cold logic of mechanized conflict. Yet even within that brutal paradigm, there remained a fundamental expectation of control, an understanding that droid armies followed commands, that strategies unfolded according to intent, and that no matter how vast the war became, it was still governed by the decisions of those who led it. That expectation began to fracture in subtle ways at first, then with increasing clarity, as reports emerged from separatist-controlled systems describing behavior within their own fleets that defied explanation, actions that did not align with command protocols, and movements that seemed guided by something other than the centralized intelligence that had once ensured their coordination. In the industrial sectors where vast foundries produced the endless ranks of battle droids, anomalies began to surface that could not be easily dismissed as technical malfunctions or sabotage. Entire production lines halted without command, their systems entering states of suspended operation despite all diagnostics indicating full functionality, while in other facilities, droids activated prematurely, moving through assembly lines with a purpose that had not been programmed, their optics glowing faintly with an energy signature that did not match their standard power sources. Engineers and overseers attempted to regain control, issuing override commands, resetting systems, even physically disconnecting units, but the disruptions persisted, spreading across networks that should have been isolated, as if something had found a way to move through the very infrastructure that defined the separatist war machine. At the heart of the Confederacy, where strategic decisions were made and executed with ruthless precision, the first indications of a deeper problem began to take hold, as fleet commanders reported losing contact with entire task forces sent to reinforce Outer Rim territories. Unlike the Republic, which often struggled with delayed communication and bureaucratic inefficiencies, the Separatists prided themselves on the reliability of their command networks, their ability to coordinate across vast distances with minimal delay, and so the sudden silence of these fleets carried a weight that could not be ignored. Initial assumptions pointed toward Republic interference, perhaps a new form of electronic warfare or a coordinated offensive designed to disrupt their operations. Yet as more reports came in, it became clear that the pattern did not align with any known Republic capability. General Grievous, ever the instrument of destruction, responded as he always had, with overwhelming force and direct engagement, dispatching additional fleets to investigate and eliminate whatever threat was responsible. His approach, effective against conventional enemies, proved insufficient in this case, as the forces he sent either failed to return or reported encounters that defied his understanding of warfare. Descriptions of massive, unidentified constructs capable of disabling entire formations with minimal effort began to circulate, their crews, where organic personnel were present, exhibiting signs of confusion and disorientation even before direct engagement occurred. These accounts, though fragmented, shared a common thread: an enemy that did not behave as expected, that did not pursue or retreat in recognizable patterns, but instead appeared, acted with precision, and then moved on as though the encounter itself had been only a minor component of a much larger objective. Within the droid armies themselves, the changes became more pronounced, as units operating in regions near the affected systems began to exhibit deviations in behavior that went beyond simple malfunction. Patrols deviated from assigned routes, engagement protocols shifted without command authorization, and in some cases, droids ceased hostilities altogether, standing motionless as if awaiting instructions that never came. Attempts to isolate these units often resulted in further anomalies, as systems that should have been compartmentalized showed signs of interconnected influence, suggesting that whatever was affecting them was not limited to individual processors, but had somehow integrated into the broader network that governed their operation. This development carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate disruptions, as it challenged the very foundation of the separatist war effort. The droid armies were designed to be predictable, controllable, and above all, obedient, their lack of autonomy a feature that ensured they could be directed without the complications inherent in organic forces. The emergence of behavior that could not be accounted for within that framework introduced a level of uncertainty that undermined their effectiveness, turning what had once been a strength into a potential vulnerability. Unbeknownst to the separatist leadership, the source of these disruptions lay not within their own systems, but in the expanding influence of the Reapers, whose methods extended beyond direct confrontation into the manipulation of both organic and synthetic entities. While their interaction with organic minds took the form of subtle indoctrination, their approach to synthetic networks was more direct, exploiting the underlying logic structures that govern machine behavior, introducing variables that altered outcomes without triggering the safeguards designed to detect intrusion. The droid armies, vast and interconnected, presented an ideal medium for such influence, their very design allowing for rapid dissemination of these alterations once an entry point had been established. In regions where Reaper presence had been established, the integration was more complete, as droid units began to operate in ways that aligned with objectives that were not their own, securing locations, redirecting resources, and in some cases, actively assisting in the containment and processing of organic populations. These actions, though not yet widespread, marked the beginning of a shift in the role of the separatist forces, from independent agents of war to unwitting extensions of a far greater system, one that viewed them not as allies or enemies, but as tools to be utilized in the execution of its purpose. On the Republic side, the effects of these developments were felt indirectly at first, as intelligence reports indicated a decrease in coordinated separatist activity in certain regions, creating opportunities for Republic advances that seemed almost too easy. Systems that had been heavily defended were suddenly vulnerable, their garrisons unresponsive or disorganized, allowing clone forces to secure strategic positions with minimal resistance. While this was initially seen as a turning point in the war, a sign that the Separatists were beginning to falter under sustained pressure, the Jedi overseeing these operations sensed something was not right, as the absence of resistance did not carry the usual signs of defeat, but instead felt hollow, as though the enemy had simply ceased to engage for reasons that remained unclear. In one such operation, a Republic fleet under Jedi command moved to reclaim a system that had recently gone silent, expecting to encounter weakened defenses, but instead finding something far more unsettling. The droid forces present did not engage in combat, nor did they attempt to retreat, but stood in fixed positions, their sensors active, their weapons powered, yet their actions devoid of purpose as understood by their programming. When Republic troops advanced, there was no response, no attempt to defend or counterattack, only a silent observation that persisted until the moment a new presence entered the system. From the edge of the sensor range, a signal emerged, one that did not conform to any known transmission format, yet carried with it a clarity that bypassed conventional communication systems. The droid units reacted instantly, their previously inert forms activating in unison, not to engage the Republic forces, but to reorient themselves toward the source of that signal, as if responding to a command that superseded all others. The Republic fleet, caught in the midst of this shift, could do little but observe as the situation transformed from a potential victory into something far more uncertain. Moments later, the first of the Reaper constructs entered the system, its massive form dwarfing even the largest capital ships, its presence exerting a pressure that could be felt even through the void of space. The droid forces moved to secure the area, their actions now aligned with the arrival of this new entity, as though they had always been intended to serve this purpose. The Republic fleet, faced with a scenario that defied all prior understanding, initiated a withdrawal, recognizing that the engagement was no longer within the scope of a conventional battle. As the fleet retreated, the realization began to take hold that the war they had been fighting was no longer confined to two sides, that the lines between Republic and Separatist were beginning to blur in the face of a threat that did not recognize those distinctions. The Clone Wars, which had defined the galaxy for so long, were being subsumed into a larger conflict, one in which both factions risked becoming irrelevant, their forces repurposed, their strategies rendered obsolete. Back on Coruscant, as reports of these events began to reach the highest levels of command, the urgency of the situation could no longer be contained within isolated discussions or limited responses. The patterns were becoming too clear, the anomalies too widespread, and the implications too severe to ignore. The galaxy was changing, not through a single decisive event, but through a series of interconnected developments that pointed toward a single conclusion, one that few were yet willing to fully accept. The enemy they faced was not simply defeating them in battle. It was rewriting the rules of the war itself. By the time the full scope of the anomaly began to reveal itself, there was only one mind in the galaxy that truly grasped both its danger and its potential, and that mind sat at the very center of power, hidden behind the calm, measured presence of Chancellor Palpatine. While the Jedi Council debated classifications and the Separatists struggled to contain disruptions within their own forces, Palpatine had already begun to piece together the fragments of intelligence into something far more coherent, something that extended beyond the immediate chaos and into the underlying pattern guiding it. He did not see isolated incidents or disconnected anomalies, but the early stages of a coordinated incursion, one that operated with a level of precision and inevitability that rivaled even his own carefully constructed plans. Within the privacy of his chambers, Far from the scrutiny of the Senate and the watchful senses of the Jedi, he allowed himself to fully explore the implications of what was unfolding, reaching out through the dark side of the Force not to confront this new presence, but to observe it, to trace the edges of its influence as it spread across the galaxy. What he encountered was unlike anything he had ever touched before, not the turbulent currents of emotion that define the dark side, nor the serene flow of the light, but something structured, vast, and utterly indifferent, an intelligence that did not react, did not feel, but simply was, operating according to a logic that transcended the conflicts of organic life. This realization did not inspire fear in him, not in the way it might have for others, but it did demand respect, for he understood instinctively that this was not a force that could be manipulated through conventional means. The Sith had always relied on control, on bending others to their will through fear, deception, and power, but this entity, whatever it truly was, did not appear to possess the vulnerabilities that made such tactics effective. It did not crave power, did not fear loss, did not seek domination in the traditional sense, and therefore could not be easily coerced or enticed. Yet within that realization lay the seed of something far more dangerous, for if it could not be controlled, perhaps it could be understood, and if it could be understood, then there might be a way to redirect it, to align its actions, however slightly, with his own ultimate objective. The rise of the Empire, the destruction of the Jedi, and the consolidation of power across the galaxy were all still within reach, but this new variable threatened to disrupt the timing, to introduce chaos into a plan that had been meticulously crafted over decades. He could not allow that to happen. At the same time, he could not ignore the possibility that this force, if properly leveraged, might accelerate his plans beyond anything he had originally envisioned. The idea of a threat so overwhelming that it forced the galaxy into a state of desperation, one that would justify the complete centralization of power, the dissolution of the Republic, and the emergence of a singular authority capable of ensuring survival, was not only appealing, but perfectly aligned with the narrative he had been constructing. Fear, after all, was one of the most effective tools in reshaping societies, and a threat that could not be reasoned with would generate a level of fear unparalleled in galactic history. With this in mind, Palpatine began to subtly adjust his approach, not in ways that would be immediately noticeable, but through small shifts in policy and communication that guided the Republic toward a state of heightened alert without fully revealing the nature of the threat. He authorized increased military readiness in regions reporting anomalies, framed as precautionary measures against potential separatist escalation, while quietly ensuring that information regarding the true nature of these events remained fragmented, incomplete, and difficult to interpret. The Senate, already overwhelmed by the war, accepted these measures without significant resistance, viewing them as necessary steps in an increasingly unpredictable conflict. At the same time, he began to probe the phenomenon more directly, utilizing resources that extended beyond the Republic's official channels. Through agents operating in the shadows, he gathered data from affected systems, seeking patterns that might reveal the underlying structure of this new force. Reports of indoctrination-like effects, though not yet fully understood, were of particular interest, as they suggested a method of influence that paralleled, in some ways, the manipulation techniques employed by the Sith, though on a scale and with a subtlety that far exceeded anything he had achieved. This aspect intrigued him deeply, as it hinted at a mechanism that could potentially be studied, perhaps even replicated, if its principles could be deciphered. The ability to influence minds without direct confrontation, to guide decisions without overt control, was a power that aligned closely with his own methods, yet operated with a level of efficiency that suggested a fundamentally different approach. If he could uncover the nature of this influence, if he could understand how it interacted with both organic minds and the Force itself, it might provide him with a means of enhancing his own capabilities, of extending his reach in ways previously thought impossible. However, his attempts to directly engage with the source of this influence through the Force yielded limited results, as the presence he sought to understand did not respond in any meaningful way. It was not that it resisted him, but rather that it did not acknowledge him at all, existing in a state that seemed entirely self-contained, unaffected by the currents of the Force that he had mastered. This lack of interaction was, in itself, a form of resistance, one that denied him the feedback he relied upon to refine his understanding. Despite this limitation, he persisted, recognizing that even partial insight could prove valuable, and as more data became available, a clearer picture began to form. The phenomenon was not random, nor was it reactive in the way most threats were, but proactive, methodical, and above all, patient. It did not rush to conquer or destroy, but instead prepared, aligning conditions in ways that ensured success before fully committing its resources. This approach, while different in execution, mirrored his own philosophy, reinforcing his belief that this was not an enemy to be underestimated or confronted directly without preparation. Meanwhile, the effects of this growing influence continued to ripple outward, affecting not only the strategic landscape of the war, but the very fabric of galactic society. Systems that had once been stable began to exhibit signs of internal discord, their leadership making decisions that undermined their own security, while others isolated themselves entirely, cutting off communication in ways that left them vulnerable to whatever might come next. The Jedi, increasingly aware of these developments, found themselves stretched thinner than ever, their efforts divided between the ongoing war and the investigation of a threat that remained frustratingly elusive. Within the Jedi Temple, discussions grew more urgent, as the pattern of disturbances became impossible to ignore, yet even as they sought to respond, they found themselves constrained by the very structure they served. The Republic required their presence on the front lines, their role as generals taking precedence over their function as guardians of peace, and this division of focus limited their ability to fully address the emerging crisis. Some among them began to question whether the war itself was obscuring a greater threat, whether the conflict they had been fighting was, in some way, a distraction from something far more significant. Palpatine, aware of these discussions, allowed them to continue, even subtly encouraging them where it served his purposes, as doubt within the Jedi Order weakened their cohesion, making them more susceptible to the events he had already set in motion. Yet even as he manipulated these internal dynamics, he remained acutely aware that the Reapers, though not yet fully revealed, represented a force that could disrupt his plans if not properly accounted for. And so, he prepared, not for a direct confrontation, but for a convergence, a moment when his own designs and the actions of this new force would intersect in a way that would determine the future of the galaxy. He did not yet know whether that intersection would lead to conflict, cooperation, or something in between, but he understood one thing with absolute clarity. The game had changed. And for the first time in a very long time, he was no longer the only one shaping its outcome. By the time the true scale of the disruption could no longer be denied, the galaxy had already begun to fracture in ways that no single battle or campaign could explain, as if the invisible threads that held entire systems together were being pulled apart one by one, not through direct force, but through a slow unraveling of trust, coordination, and identity. What had once been a clearly defined conflict between the Republic and the Separatists now blurred into something far more chaotic, as reports from across both territories painted a picture of a war losing its structure, its predictability, and ultimately its meaning. Fleets arrived at rendezvous points to find their allies missing or unresponsive, reinforcements failed to appear where they were most needed, and entire sectors seemed to drift into isolation, their leaders making decisions that cut them off from the very networks that had once ensured their survival. For the Republic, this fragmentation manifested as a growing sense of instability within its command structure, as orders issued from Coruscant were delayed, misinterpreted, or quietly altered before reaching their intended recipients, creating inconsistencies that undermined even the most carefully planned operations. Jedi generals found themselves questioning not only the reliability of their intelligence, but the intentions behind it, as missions that should have been straightforward turned into unpredictable engagements with outcomes that defied logic. The clones, ever loyal and precise, executed their orders without hesitation, yet even their efficiency could not compensate for the subtle distortions guiding those orders, as they were sent into situations where the objectives no longer aligned with the reality on the ground. Among the Jedi, the strain was becoming increasingly evident, not only in their physical deployment across countless battlefronts, but in their connection to the Force itself, which now carried an undercurrent of dissonance that made it difficult to discern truth from interference. Meditation, once a source of clarity, became an exercise in filtering out a growing background noise, a faint but persistent pressure that seemed to nudge thoughts in directions that did not entirely belong to the individual experiencing them. For those attuned to the Force, this was more than a distraction, it was a violation, a subtle intrusion that challenged their ability to trust their own perceptions. Some Jedi began to withdraw from frontline command, seeking to better understand this phenomenon, while others doubled down on their duties, believing that maintaining order in the face of uncertainty was the best way to counter whatever was emerging. This divergence in approach, though rooted in the same desire to protect the galaxy, created tension within the Order, as differing priorities led to disagreements over how best to respond. The unity that had long defined the Jedi began to show cracks, not through open conflict, but through the quiet divergence of purpose, as each individual grappled with a threat that did not present itself in a form they could easily confront. On the Separatist side, the situation was no less dire, though it manifested in ways that were even more difficult to control, as the very systems that enabled their war effort became conduits for something they could neither detect nor eliminate. The droid armies, once the backbone of their strategy, now operated with an increasing degree of unpredictability, as units across multiple sectors exhibited behaviors that did not align with their programming. Some continued to function as expected, carrying out orders with mechanical precision, while others deviated in subtle but significant ways, their actions no longer fully synchronized with central command. This inconsistency eroded the confidence of Separatist leaders, who relied on the reliability of their forces to maintain control over their territories, and as more systems reported anomalies, the sense of cohesion that had once defined their movement began to collapse. Attempts to isolate affected networks proved ineffective, as the influence responsible for these changes did not adhere to the boundaries imposed by their architecture, spreading through pathways that were not meant to carry such signals, integrating itself into the very logic that governed their operations. In some regions, the breakdown was more pronounced, as entire fleets ceased to respond to command inputs, their ships holding position in space as if awaiting instructions from an unseen authority. When those instructions came, they did not originate from any known command center, but from signals that bypassed standard protocols, directing these forces toward objectives that aligned with a pattern only visible when viewed on a galactic scale. These movements, while isolated at first, began to form a network of activity that extended across both Republic and Separatist territories, linking systems in ways that defied political boundaries. Amid this growing chaos, independent systems found themselves increasingly vulnerable, as the structures that had once provided a degree of stability dissolved under the weight of uncertainty. Without the protection of a unified military presence, these worlds were left to interpret the situation on their own, often arriving at conclusions that led them to isolate themselves, cutting off communication and fortifying their defenses against threats they could not fully identify. In doing so, they inadvertently made themselves easier targets, their isolation removing any possibility of coordinated response when the next phase of the invasion reached them. The criminal underworld, always quick to exploit instability, initially thrived in this environment, as disrupted trade routes and weakened defenses created opportunities for expansion and profit. However, even these networks, built on adaptability and decentralized control, began to falter as the influence spreading through the galaxy reached into their ranks. Smugglers, bounty hunters, and syndicate leaders found their operations disrupted not by external forces, but by internal inconsistencies, decisions that undermined their own interests, and alliances that dissolved without clear cause. The same subtle manipulation affecting governments and militaries began to erode the foundations of these organizations, demonstrating that no structure, no matter how informal or resilient, was immune to the broader pattern taking hold. At the center of all this, Coruscant remained a paradox of order and instability, its surface unchanged, its systems functioning, yet beneath that veneer, the same fractures were beginning to form. The Senate continued its sessions, debates carried out with the same formality and procedure as before, yet the outcomes of those debates increasingly reflected the underlying distortions spreading through the galaxy. Decisions that should have strengthened the Republic often resulted in unintended weaknesses, while opportunities to address the emerging threat were delayed or redirected, not through overt opposition, but through a series of small, seemingly reasonable choices that collectively led to inaction. For Chancellor Palpatine, this fragmentation served both as a warning and an opportunity, as the conditions he had long sought to create, a galaxy in need of strong, centralized control, were now emerging at an accelerated pace, driven not solely by his own manipulations, but by the influence of an external force that operated with its own agenda. He continued to guide events where he could, steering the Republic toward greater militarization, reinforcing the narrative that only through unity under a single authority could the galaxy hope to survive, yet even he recognized that the situation was evolving beyond the scope of his original plan. The Jedi, sensing the growing instability, began to consider the possibility that the war itself was no longer the primary concern, that the conflict between Republic and Separatists had become secondary to a larger threat that neither side was prepared to face. This realization, though not yet universally accepted, marked a turning point in their understanding, as it suggested that the path forward might require cooperation where there had been only opposition, unity where there had been division. Yet even as this idea began to take shape, the forces driving the galaxy toward fragmentation continued their work, ensuring that such unity would be difficult to achieve. Distrust, already present due to years of war, was amplified by the subtle influence spreading through key individuals, making the prospect of alliance seem risky, even impossible, to those who might otherwise have considered it. Far beyond the reach of these internal struggles, the Reapers observed the results of their initial phase with calculated precision, their awareness encompassing the shifting dynamics of the galaxy as it moved toward a state of disarray that would make the next stage of their operation far more efficient. They did not need to destroy every fleet or conquer every world individually, not when the structures that supported those entities could be destabilized from within, reducing the need for direct confrontation. The galaxy, once defined by its interconnected systems and the balance maintained by the Force, was being reshaped into something far more vulnerable, a collection of isolated fragments drifting toward a convergence they could not yet see. And as that convergence approached, the realization began to take hold among those who could perceive it, that the greatest strength the galaxy had once possessed, its diversity, its complexity, its interconnectedness, was now being turned against it, transformed into the very mechanism that would enable its downfall. The war was no longer being fought on battlefields alone. It was being fought in the space between decisions, in the subtle shifts of thought that guided entire civilizations, and in the growing inability of the galaxy to recognize the true nature of the enemy it faced until it was already too late. The idea of alliance did not arrive as a bold declaration or a moment of clarity shared across the galaxy, but as a quiet, reluctant realization that began in the minds of a few individuals who had seen enough to understand that the war they had been fighting was no longer the war that mattered. It surfaced first in fragments, in conversations held behind closed doors, in reports that hinted at patterns too large to ignore, and in the growing awareness among certain rebel-aligned cells, early resistance groups, and disillusioned Republic officers that something far greater than the Empire or the Separatists was beginning to take hold. These were not people inclined toward cooperation with their enemies, not individuals who would easily set aside years of conflict and loss, yet the evidence before them was becoming impossible to dismiss. Entire systems were no longer just falling, they were disappearing in a manner that left no survivors, no resistance movements, no lingering signals of occupation or control. Where the Empire might subjugate and the Separatists might conquer, this new force erased, leaving behind only silence and the faint, unsettling traces of something that had passed through with purpose and finality. Intelligence gathered from smuggling networks, independent scouts, and fragmented Republic archives began to converge, painting a picture that none of the established powers were prepared to accept publicly, but which a select few could no longer deny. Among these individuals were figures who would later become central to the formation of the Rebel Alliance, leaders who had already begun to question the direction of the Republic and the rise of authoritarian control under Palpatine. They saw in these events not only a threat to their political ideals, but an existential danger that rendered those ideals meaningless if left unaddressed. Survival, once an assumed constant, was now uncertain, and that uncertainty forced a reconsideration of priorities that had once seemed absolute. At the same time, within the Empire's expanding structure, There were those who recognized the anomaly not as a political issue, but as a strategic one, a threat that did not conform to the models of insurgency or rebellion they were trained to suppress. Imperial officers tasked with analyzing the growing number of lost fleets and silent systems began to notice inconsistencies that could not be attributed to enemy action alone, patterns that suggested a third party operating with capabilities far beyond those of any known faction. These observations, while often buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and denial, occasionally reached individuals with the authority and insight to take them seriously. It was within this narrow intersection of awareness, where ideology gave way to necessity, that the first true consideration of cooperation began to take shape. It did not come easily, nor was it openly embraced, but it existed, fragile and tentative, as a possibility that could not be entirely dismissed. The idea that the Empire and those who opposed it might need to work together was, in itself, almost unthinkable, yet the alternative, facing a force that neither side could hope to defeat alone, was beginning to seem far worse. The Jedi, positioned uniquely between these factions, were among the first to fully grasp the implications of such an alliance, though even within their order, opinions varied widely. Some saw cooperation with Imperial forces as a necessary step, a temporary measure to address a threat that endangered all life in the galaxy, while others viewed it as a dangerous compromise, one that could strengthen the very regime they opposed. This internal conflict mirrored the broader tension across the galaxy, as each group weighed the cost of unity against the risk of continued division. Master Yoda, reflecting on the growing crisis, understood that the traditional boundaries that had defined conflict in the galaxy were no longer sufficient, that survival might require choices that would have once been considered unacceptable. He did not advocate openly for alliance, but his guidance began to shift, emphasizing adaptability, awareness, and the need to see beyond the immediate conflict to the larger forces at play. In his quiet way, he prepared those who would listen for the possibility that the path forward would not align with the principles they had long held. Meanwhile, Palpatine observed these developments with careful interest, recognizing both the threat and the opportunity they presented. The notion of a unified response to an external enemy could serve his purposes, reinforcing his position as the central authority capable of coordinating such an effort, yet it also carried the risk of empowering those who might oppose his ultimate plans. He understood that any alliance formed under these circumstances would need to be controlled, guided in a way that maintained his dominance while allowing others to believe they were acting independently. To that end, he began to subtly shape the narrative surrounding the emerging threat, allowing fragments of information to surface in controlled ways, enough to generate concern, but not enough to fully reveal the nature of what was coming. He framed the situation as a series of escalating anomalies, potential new enemy tactics, or unknown technologies, avoiding any suggestion that the galaxy faced something fundamentally different from what it had encountered before. This approach ensured that while discussions of cooperation might begin, they would do so within a framework that he could influence, preventing any unified effort from forming outside his control. Despite these manipulations, the reality of the situation continued to assert itself as more systems fell and more evidence accumulated, forcing even the most resistant factions to acknowledge that the threat they faced could not be contained through conventional means. In isolated instances, temporary ceasefires were established, not as formal agreements, but as practical responses to immediate danger, allowing opposing forces to focus on a common objective when confronted directly with the new enemy. These moments, though limited in scope, demonstrated that cooperation was possible, even if only under extreme circumstances. One such encounter occurred on the edge of a contested system, where Republic and Separatist forces, both drawn by reports of unusual activity, arrived simultaneously to investigate. Initial tensions ran high, as each side prepared for engagement, yet before any conflict could begin, the arrival of a Reaper construct shifted the situation entirely. Faced with an opponent that neither could effectively engage alone, the two forces found themselves fighting side by side, their combined efforts barely sufficient to delay the entity's advance long enough to withdraw. The experience left a lasting impression on those involved, a stark demonstration of both the scale of the threat and the potential necessity of unity. These encounters, though rare, began to circulate as quiet rumors, stories of enemies working together not out of trust, but out of necessity, and while they did not immediately lead to widespread alliance, they planted a seed, an idea that might grow as the situation continued to deteriorate. The galaxy, fragmented and uncertain, stood on the edge of a transformation that would challenge its deepest divisions, forcing choices that would redefine the nature of conflict itself. Beyond these shifting dynamics, the Reapers continued their advance, their operations now entering a phase where preparation gave way to direct action on a larger scale. The alignment of variables, the subtle manipulation of systems and minds, had achieved its purpose, creating conditions that would allow for a more efficient harvest. The galaxy, weakened from within, divided by conflict, and only beginning to consider unity, was approaching the point where resistance, even if coordinated, would face overwhelming odds. And as the first major strikes against core systems were prepared, the fragile notion of alliance faced its ultimate test, as the galaxy would soon be forced to confront the reality that cooperation was not merely an option, but perhaps the only path to survival, even if that path required standing alongside former enemies against a force that recognized no distinction between them. The moment the Reapers chose to strike Coruscant was not marked by warning, declaration, or the gradual buildup of forces that typically preceded a major assault, but by a sudden and overwhelming rupture in the fabric of the galaxy's perceived security, as if the illusion of invulnerability surrounding the capital had simply ceased to exist. For generations, Coruscant had stood as the unshakable center of civilization, a world so deeply fortified, so constantly defended, that the very idea of a direct attack bordered on the impossible, yet that assumption had been built on an understanding of warfare that no longer applied. The Reapers did not approach as conventional fleets, did not signal their intent or test the defenses through incremental engagement, but instead emerged with absolute precision, their massive forms tearing into real space at the edges of the system with a silence that was more terrifying than any bombardment. The first to detect them were the outer defense platforms, their sensors struggling to interpret the readings before them, as the signatures did not match any known class of vessel, their mass and energy output exceeding expected limits by orders of magnitude. Alerts were transmitted across the system, cascading from station to station, reaching the orbital shipyards and defense fleets in rapid succession, yet even as the alarms sounded, the scale of the threat remained difficult to comprehend. Star destroyers repositioned, fighter squadrons launched, and planetary shields intensified, all according to protocols designed for large-scale assault, yet none of these preparations accounted for what was about to unfold. The Reapers did not engage immediately, and in that brief moment of stillness, a pressure settled over the system, subtle at first, then growing as if the very presence of these entities exerted an influence that extended beyond physical space. Across Coruscant, individuals sensitive to the Force felt it most acutely, a void that spread like a shadow across their perception, disrupting their connection, distorting their awareness, and introducing a sense of dissonance that made it difficult to focus. Even those without such sensitivity experienced an unease they could not explain, a tension that permeated the atmosphere as the reality of the situation began to take hold. Then, without warning, the first beam fired. It did not resemble the turbolaser barrages that had defined space combat for centuries, nor the focused energy of known superweapons, but something more concentrated, more precise, a stream of energy that cut through space with terrifying efficiency, striking one of the outer defense platforms and reducing it to molten debris in a matter of seconds. There was no prolonged exchange, no opportunity for countermeasure, only the instantaneous demonstration of power that left no doubt as to the disparity between the forces now engaged. The Imperial fleet responded with everything it had, star destroyers unleashing volleys of turbolaser fire, their combined output capable of overwhelming most known targets. Yet as the barrage struck the approaching Reapers, it became immediately clear that this was not a battle that could be won through sheer firepower alone. The energy impacts flared against invisible barriers, dissipating in waves of light that barely slowed the advance of the massive constructs, their movements steady, deliberate, as if the attacks against them were little more than environmental noise. Within the command structures of the defense fleet, confusion quickly gave way to urgency, as officers attempted to adapt to a threat that defied their expectations. Targeting systems recalibrated, strategies shifted, and orders were issued in rapid succession, yet each adjustment seemed to produce little effect, as the Reapers continued their advance with an inevitability that undermined even the most coordinated response. The scale of the engagement escalated rapidly, as more Imperial forces were drawn into the conflict, their numbers growing, yet their effectiveness remaining limited against an enemy that seemed designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault. At the same time, something else began to unfold, something less visible, but no less significant, as the signal accompanying the Reapers spread across the system, reaching into the minds of those present, not as a command, but as a presence, a constant, intrusive awareness that began to influence thought and perception. For many, it manifested as confusion, hesitation, a subtle erosion of certainty that made decision-making increasingly difficult, while for others, particularly those already affected by the earlier phases of indoctrination, it acted as a catalyst, amplifying existing influence and aligning their actions with the objectives of the invading force. In the midst of this chaos, a development occurred that would have been unthinkable under any other circumstances, as elements of the Rebel Alliance, having tracked the anomalies leading to Coruscant, arrived on the outskirts of the system. Their presence, initially viewed as an opportunistic move to exploit Imperial vulnerability, quickly took on a different significance as the reality of the situation became clear. The threat facing the Empire was not one that could be leveraged for strategic gain, but one that threatened all sides equally, and in that moment, the lines that had defined the conflict began to blur in a way that had never been seen before. Imperial commanders, faced with an enemy that rendered their conventional strategies ineffective, found themselves in the unprecedented position of acknowledging the potential value of additional forces, even those they would normally engage without hesitation. Communication between the two sides was limited, cautious, and often indirect. Yet the shared objective of survival created a functional alignment that allowed for a degree of coordination, however fragile it might be. Rebel ships joined the defensive effort, their smaller, more agile craft targeting areas where Imperial firepower had proven insufficient, while Imperial capital ships adjusted their formations to accommodate the new variables in the engagement. At the center of it all, Darth Vader moved with singular purpose, his presence a focal point within the chaos. As he piloted his craft through the battle, his connection to the Force guiding his actions in a way that compensated, at least partially, for the disruption surrounding him. He felt the void more clearly than most, the absence that defined the Reaper's presence, and within that absence, he sensed something that both intrigued and disturbed him, a form of existence that lay outside the influence of the Force, yet interacted with it in ways that could not be ignored. His attacks were precise, targeted, focusing on specific points where the Reaper's defenses showed even the slightest fluctuation, and while his efforts did not produce immediate, decisive results, they demonstrated that the constructs were not entirely beyond reach, that under the right conditions, their defenses could be challenged. This realization spread quickly through the combined forces, prompting adjustments in targeting strategies, as both Imperial and Rebel units began to focus their fire in coordinated bursts, attempting to replicate the effects achieved through Vader's actions. Despite these efforts, the battle remained overwhelmingly in the Reaper's favor, as more of their number entered the system, each one adding to the pressure exerted on the defenders, each one contributing to a gradual shift in the balance that could not be easily reversed. The planetary shields of Coruscant, though immense, began to show signs of strain under the sustained assault, their energy reserves depleting as they absorbed impacts that exceeded their intended capacity. On the surface, panic began to spread, as the reality of the situation reached the population, the once unthinkable scenario of Coruscant under direct attack becoming an undeniable fact. Evacuation protocols were initiated, though the sheer scale of the planet made such efforts limited in effectiveness, and for many, the only option was to remain and hope that the defenses would hold. Within the Jedi Temple, those who remained reached out through the Force, combining their efforts in an attempt to counter the growing disturbance, to create a point of clarity amidst the chaos that might provide guidance or strength to those engaged in the battle above. Their efforts, while significant, were met with resistance, as the void introduced by the Reapers disrupted their connection, forcing them to push beyond their limits to maintain even a semblance of cohesion. As the battle raged on, the fragile alliance between Empire and rebels held, not out of trust, but necessity, as both sides recognized that the outcome of this engagement would determine not just the fate of Coruscant, but the trajectory of the entire galaxy. Victory, in the traditional sense, was already beyond reach, replaced by a more immediate objective, survival, and the hope that through combined effort, they might at least halt the advance long enough to find a way forward. But as the Reapers continued their relentless assault, their movements calculated, their objectives unwavering, it became increasingly clear that this battle was not meant to be won, not here, not now, but to demonstrate something far more important. That even the heart of the galaxy could fall. The fall did not come as a single, decisive moment, but as a slow, inevitable collapse that unfolded across multiple layers of the Coruscant system, each failure compounding the next until resistance itself began to feel like a delay rather than a defense. What had once been the most secure world in the galaxy was now the focal point of a conflict that exposed every weakness hidden beneath its immense power, as the Reapers pressed their advantage with a patience that bordered on indifference. They did not rush to destroy the planet outright, nor did they expend unnecessary force against targets already neutralized, but instead maintained a constant, measured pressure that ensured the system would break under its own strain. In orbit, the combined Imperial and Rebel fleets continued to fight with a determination born not from hope of victory, but from the understanding that every moment gained mattered, that every second the planetary shields remained intact was another chance for evacuation, for regrouping, for survival beyond this battle. Star destroyers, once symbols of unquestioned dominance, now served as barriers, placing themselves directly in the path of Reaper beams, absorbing impacts that tore through their hulls with devastating precision. Rebel cruisers and starfighters darted through the chaos, exploiting the smallest openings, coordinating strikes that briefly disrupted the enemy's advance, only for those gains to be erased as quickly as they were achieved. The tactics evolved in real time, shaped by observation and necessity rather than doctrine, as both sides adapted to an opponent that did not respond to conventional strategies. Concentrated fire on specific points yielded limited success, momentarily destabilizing the barriers surrounding the Reapers, while coordinated maneuvers allowed for brief windows where damage could be inflicted, yet these efforts required a level of precision and timing that could not be sustained indefinitely, especially under the constant psychological pressure exerted by the invading force. The signal that accompanied the Reapers continued to spread, intensifying as more constructs entered the system, amplifying confusion, eroding focus, and gradually undermining the ability of even the most disciplined crews to maintain cohesion. For those sensitive to the Force, the experience bordered on overwhelming, as the void introduced by the Reapers clashed violently with their connection, creating a dissonance that made it difficult to distinguish between their own instincts and the subtle distortions imposed upon them. Jedi and Sith alike found their abilities compromised, not removed entirely, but altered in ways that reduced their effectiveness at the precise moment they were needed most. Darth Vader, at the center of the battle, pushed through this interference with sheer will, his connection to the dark side acting as both shield and weapon, allowing him to maintain a degree of clarity where others faltered. Yet even he could not ignore the limits imposed by this new form of opposition, as the techniques that had once ensured his dominance now met resistance that could not be overcome through strength alone. On the surface of Coruscant, the consequences of the orbital battle began to manifest with increasing severity as fragments of destroyed ships fell through the atmosphere, igniting the skies with streaks of fire that marked the descent of war into the heart of the planet. Defense systems activated at full capacity, intercepting debris and incoming strikes where possible, yet the scale of the engagement ensured that not everything could be stopped. Sections of the city planet, vast beyond comprehension, began to suffer localized damage. Entire districts plunged into darkness as power grids failed under the strain. The population, numbering in the trillions, responded as populations always did in the face of the unimaginable, with a mixture of panic, denial, and desperate attempts to maintain order. Evacuation efforts, already underway, struggled to keep pace with the unfolding crisis, as transport routes became congested, communication networks overloaded, and conflicting reports created confusion that hindered coordination. For many, escape was not an option, and the focus shifted from leaving the planet to surviving what might come next. Within the halls of power, the Senate chambers that had once echoed with debate now served as a command center for a government push to the brink, as officials scrambled to respond to a situation that had surpassed all previous contingencies. Chancellor Palpatine, outwardly composed, continued to direct operations with calculated precision, his commands reinforcing the defensive effort while simultaneously positioning himself as the indispensable figure at the center of the crisis. Yet beneath that controlled exterior, his mind worked through the implications of what was unfolding, recalibrating his plans in real time as the scale of the threat became undeniable. He had anticipated upheaval, had even cultivated it, but this was something different, something that could not be contained within the framework of his design. The Reapers did not seek to rule, did not engage in the political structures he had mastered, and therefore could not be easily integrated into his vision of the future. They represented an endpoint, a force that reduced all systems, all hierarchies, to a singular outcome that left no room for control or manipulation. This realization forced him to confront a possibility he had long dismissed, that there might be a power in the galaxy that he could not bend to his will. Even so, he did not abandon his ambitions, but adapted them, recognizing that survival through this crisis would require not only resistance, but transformation. The Republic, already on the verge of becoming the Empire, would need to evolve further, to become something capable of withstanding a threat of this magnitude, and that transformation would require absolute authority, unquestioned and unchallenged. In the chaos of the battle, he saw the conditions necessary to justify that shift, the fear, the desperation, the need for a singular guiding force, and he prepared to use it, even as the outcome of the conflict remained uncertain. Above the planet, the situation reached a critical point as the planetary shields, strained beyond their intended limits, began to falter. Fluctuations appeared across their surface, momentary breaches that allowed Reaper fire to penetrate, striking key installations and further weakening the defensive network. Each impact brought the system closer to collapse, as the margin for error diminished with every passing moment. The fleets, already depleted, struggled to compensate, their numbers reduced, their coordination strained, yet they continued to fight, driven by the knowledge that retreat would mean abandoning the galaxy's core to a fate none fully understood. Amid this escalating crisis, a shift occurred, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as the Reapers altered their pattern of attack, redirecting their focus from the orbital defenses to the planet itself. Their beams, once concentrated on ships and stations, began to target the surface with increasing frequency, each strike precise, calculated, aimed not at random destruction, but at specific locations that held strategic or symbolic significance. The message was clear, even if unspoken, that the time for preparation had passed, and the next phase had begun. The combined forces responded with renewed intensity, throwing everything they had into the defense of the planet, yet the disparity remained, the Reapers' advantage insurmountable through conventional means. Losses mounted, ships destroyed, crews lost, and still the advance continued, each moment bringing the galaxy closer to a reality it had never been forced to face before. And as the first sustained breaches in the planetary shields began to widen, allowing the full force of the Reaper assault to reach the surface of Coruscant, the final illusion shattered, not just for those fighting the battle, but for the galaxy as a whole. There was no safe world, no untouchable power, no guaranteed future, only the fight to endure what came next. In the end, the Reaper invasion of the Star Wars galaxy does not conclude with a triumphant victory, nor with a single decisive moment of defeat, but with a transformation so profound that it reshapes the very nature of existence within that galaxy, leaving behind a reality that is neither the one that came before nor one that can be easily understood by those who survive it. The fall of Coruscant, whether total or partial, becomes less important than what it represents, the undeniable proof that no system, no power, and no belief structure is beyond the reach of a force that operates on a scale and with a purpose far beyond anything the galaxy has ever encountered. The Republic, already teetering on the edge of becoming the Empire, does not simply transition through political manipulation as it once might have, but is forced into a far more desperate evolution, one driven by survival rather than ambition alone. Palpatine still rises, still consolidates power, but not in the controlled, calculated manner he had envisioned. Instead, emerging as the leader of a galaxy under siege, his authority justified not by fear of war between factions, but by the existential terror of annihilation. In this version of events, the Empire is born not as a tool of domination, but as a last, unified front against an enemy that cannot be reasoned with, and in doing so, it becomes something both more powerful and more fragile, as its legitimacy depends entirely on its ability to protect what remains. The Jedi Order, already strained by the Clone Wars, faces a crisis that challenges not only its role, but its understanding of the Force itself. The Reapers, existing outside the traditional balance of light and dark, force the Jedi to confront the possibility that the Force, as they have known it, is not the ultimate framework of existence, but one aspect of a much larger reality. Some Jedi adapt, learning to navigate the void left in the wake of the Reaper's influence, finding new ways to connect, to resist, and to guide others through a galaxy that no longer behaves as it once did. Others are lost, not only in battle, but in the collapse of the certainty that had defined their purpose, unable to reconcile their beliefs with the new reality unfolding around them. For the Sith, the invasion represents both a challenge and a revelation, as their reliance on control and domination is confronted by a force that cannot be dominated in any traditional sense. Palpatine, ever adaptable, may seek to understand and even exploit aspects of the Reaper's methods, but he does so with the growing awareness that there are limits to his influence, boundaries that cannot be crossed through will alone. This does not diminish his ambition, but it reshapes it, forcing him to operate within a universe that now includes an equal, or perhaps superior, power. The war between Republic and Separatists, which once defined the era, becomes almost irrelevant in the face of the larger conflict, its battles either subsumed into the broader struggle or abandoned entirely as both sides are forced to confront the same enemy. In some cases, alliances form, fragile and temporary, as survival outweighs ideology, while in others, old conflicts persist even as the Reapers advance, demonstrating that even in the face of extinction, division can endure. And the Reapers themselves continue, as they always have, their purpose unchanged, their methods refined through countless cycles, their advance slowed perhaps, challenged in ways unique to a galaxy rich in the Force, but not stopped. The Star Wars galaxy does not fall easily. Its diversity, its resilience, and its connection to something greater than itself providing a level of resistance that may exceed what the Reapers have encountered before, yet even this resistance comes at a cost, measured not only in worlds lost, but in the transformation of those that remain. What emerges from this conflict is not a clear victor, but a galaxy fundamentally altered, where power is redefined, alliances are reshaped, and the very understanding of existence is expanded to include forces that were once unimaginable. It is a galaxy where the fight does not end with a single war, but continues across generations, as those who survive adapt to a new reality, one in which the shadow of the Reapers is never entirely gone, and the memory of what was lost serves as both a warning and a motivation to endure. Because in this version of the story, the question is no longer who would win. It is whether the galaxy can survive long enough to become something capable of resisting what it has become.
The multiverse doesn't end here. New invasions, new empires, and new worlds collide daily. If you enjoy deep cinematic, what-if scenarios like this, subscribe and join Multiverse Galaxy if